This film will open your eyes, not in a good way. We in the so-called Western, so-called democracies are in very real trouble. If this could happen to David Kelly, it could happen to any of us. I do believe he was killed. I do reach the definitive conclusion, and I defy any of you to differ at the end of the film, that he did not commit suicide.
Welcome. Today I'm asking, do you believe the official narrative that Weapons Inspector David Kelly killed himself, or were we lied to by Tony Blair's government? The truth is, we went to war with Iraq in 2003 after being told Saddam Hussein could deploy and activate chemical weapons within 45 minutes. This week I travelled to Oxford to watch George Galloway's explosive film Killing Kelly. Shortly we'll be hearing more from the man himself, who's one of an elite band of what I call the new media. After working in the old media for the past 45 years, I've seen firsthand how that legacy media increasingly fails to question the narrative on so many important issues. But I am encouraged by the fact there's a growing army of people who want to know more about what's really going on in the world. As I made my way to Oxford Town Hall, I was looking forward to being with like-minded citizens who don't blindly accept everything they're told by the government, the establishment and the old media. To protect our democracy and our freedom, we must retain the right to ask questions. As a filmmaker myself, I wasn't there just to watch the film. I wanted to take part in the question and answer session with filmmaker George Galloway. I wanted to show my support for a man who bravely challenges state-sponsored narratives in the UK, the USA and around the world. In a moment, we'll hear a powerful statement from George that welcomed us to the screening of his film in front of a small but well-informed audience. As I've said before, I don't agree with George on every subject, but I do 100% support his right to ask questions and put forward his forthright views. You'll have to watch the film yourself to understand why this is such an important piece of work. It's directed by Irish filmmaker Sean Murray, and it's a piece of work that demands the widest possible audience. But the evidence uncovered in the film has so far been largely overlooked by the mainstream media.
This film will open your eyes, not in a good way. Will open your eyes to some of the foundational falseness about what many of us grew up believing about this country and what we thought distinguished this country from some other countries, even nearby countries. My father was a big believer in Britain, thought that we were very different from obviously the United States, but even some of our closest European neighbours. And it turns out that's not really true. That the institutions that many of us grew up believing in, the police, the courts, the BBC, the Parliament, the civil service, Whitehall, Westminster, all the emblems, if you like, of Britishness are no more, or if they have not yet fallen, and we'll see what happens with Julian Assange in the next few days and weeks, then they are in the process of falling. David Kelly is an important figure in himself, and the Iraq War an important chapter in itself. And he has an overarching symbolic importance. And I want you to keep in mind, as you watch what happened to him, that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anybody. David Kelly was a high personage of the state. He might well have ended up in the House of Lords. He certainly would have ended up with a knighthood. In fact, a knighthood pretty quickly. In not long before he died, mysteriously, he was consulted about the knighthood. So this was an important person, a VIP in the British state. He had maximum security clearance. But as you'll see, if you have maximum security clearance, then when you lose it, you move immediately from having maximum security clearance to being a maximum security threat. Because you have in your mind, in your head, all of the secrets of the British state, including the very darkest secrets. And you then become a real and present danger to the power that exists in the land. And that's what happened to David Kelly. I don't, as you'll see in the film, name his killer, although I do believe he was killed. I do reach the definitive conclusion, and I defy any of you to differ at the end of the film, that he did not commit suicide, and he did not die on Harrowdown Hill. Now, whether he died of natural causes, under interrogation, which is a strong hypothesis, or he was killed, in a way doesn't matter. In fact, you could make an argument that the former is more sinister than the latter. Because if he died under interrogation, a considerable number of people must have concluded that that would look so bad and that a fake suicide will have to be created. A fake place of death and manner of death will have to be created. And that goes far beyond one person killing one other person. Now, I believe, I have a vested interest in this, it's true, that the fall of the Britain many of us knew can be dated to the election of Tony Blair as the Prime Minister of Britain. I'm not saying everything was hunky-dory before. As someone who wore out my shoe leather fighting against Margaret Thatcher, that would be ridiculous. As someone who was kicked by a police horse outside Wapping and spent every single day of 1984-85 fighting for the miners under Mrs. Thatcher, that would be ridiculous. But I do believe that things took a qualitative turn fundamentally for the worse under Tony Blair. And that means I must add to the institutions that have fallen the British Labour Party, in which I spent 36 years of my life. It's no longer possible to forgive them, it's no longer possible to trust them. And that leaves us in a very bad place, because the government are certainly not any better than the opposition, but the opposition are no better than the government. Now, you might say that's true in more than one country, in the United States, in France, as we found yesterday. We in the so-called Western, so-called democracies are in very real trouble. And I go back to the first thing I said. If this could happen to David Kelly, it could happen to any of us. Which is why I make the point that I hate woods. And I will never commit suicide. I will never go for a walk in the woods. So if I'm ever found having committed suicide in the woods, don't believe it for a minute.
There's another statement from George I'm going to end on shortly, when he talks about Tony Blair's then Defence Secretary, George Hoon. But first, let me tell you this. No British broadcaster has shown this film or is ever likely to do so, despite the weight of evidence it presents on a hugely important political controversy. And that in itself is a form of censorship. So I urge you to seek out and watch the film yourself, and then you can make your own judgment. You can decide for yourself if you believe the official narrative that Dr. David Kelly committed suicide after challenging claims about the weapons of mass destruction capability, or were we lied to by Tony Blair's government? A government that backed American President George Bush and went to war with Iraq in March 2003. Blair's government presented a sexed-up document that claimed Iraq could deploy and activate chemical weapons within 45 minutes of an order being given by Saddam Hussein. It is now admitted this was pure fantasy, but the weapons inspector who rubbished those claims was found dead on Harrowdown Hill near his home in Oxford on the 17th of July 2003. 19 years later, Tony Blair has been knighted, and this summer will go to Buckingham Palace to kneel before the Queen. Meantime, here's George Galloway's response to a question asked by Ian Puddick before our screening in Oxford.
Yes, Ian.
Was there anything that, with hindsight, after making the film, that you just couldn't get in for whatever reason that you now think, wish I'd got that?
I really wish that I'd been able to interview a man now long forgotten called Jeff Hoon, who was the Defence Secretary at the time, Defence Secretary during the war, and who told Andrew Ronsley, then as now of the Observer, that angry as he was at being demoted by Tony Blair, that he was planning to give a speech about Dr. David Kelly, and if he did, he would bring down the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, by the end of the afternoon. So you can surmise that what he was going to say was almost nuclear dimensions. I got close to interviewing Jeff Hoon. I actually used to play in the House of Commons football team with him and had, on a personal level, decent, good relations with him. He was almost there. But he does work for Westland's helicopters. They get a lot of orders from the Ministry of Defence.
Conflict of interest.
There was a clear conflict of interest and he backed out. That's the one big enchilada that I would have liked to have had. But the story is in the film and people can draw their own conclusions, I think, from it.
In the absence of support by traditional broadcasters, George Galloway has grown his audience for the film with a nationwide tour. And if you've missed that, you'll find Killing Kelly on DVD and Vimeo on demand, the streaming service I use myself as an independent filmmaker.